In the Pacific Palisades area, there's a brush fire. Right now, it looks like the LA Fire Department is telling us it's about 2 acres.
We have a convergence of fire trucks, police officers. There are palm trees that are on fire.
The Palisades is a complete disaster zone. Everything is gone.
Very scary, very stressful, very strange week here in LA, where we work, where we live, where our kids go to school. We are back in our studio, which we had to evacuate on Wednesday. Many of us had to leave our homes in a hurry. Some of our coworkers lost their homes.
Hello and welcome to episode 245 of the Clean Energy Show. I'm Brian Stockton.
I'm James Whittingham. This week, a special edition of the show. The devastating wildfires in Los Angeles are indicative of a new kind of fire, a 21st century kind of fire that behaves differently than before. We'll explore what was lost in Pacific Palisades, why I feel a sense of connection to that community, and why actor Martin Short loved it. We'll explore author John Vaillant's book, Fire Weather, and learn why he thinks wildfires in urban areas will continue to be the biggest threat to humanity from climate change. All that and more in the special edition of the Clean Energy Show. Brian, last week we record basically the same time every late Tuesday morning, and this was something that I had on the lightning round last week. We're talking about 100 mile per hour or 160 kilometer per hour gusts in the mountains. This has happened before, but they're saying it wasn't this dry before. So this is a very kind of dangerous situation for California this week. A mere 25 minutes after I uttered those words, the fire near the Pacific Palisades started and was reported.
In the Pacific Palisades area, there's a brush fire. Right now, it looks like the LA Fire Department is telling us it's about 2 acres. Here's the rough location of it. It's 1190 North Piedra Mirada Drive. There's a neighborhood there, and there's actually a bunch of small schools nearby too. So there's a significant presence of firefighters on the scene. I'm sure we'll continue to update you. It's grown already by about 10 acres and 40 mile per hour winds observed in this general area.
So residents fled in their cars. There's sort of an upper section to the Palisades that is only really accessible by one road, and it got clogged and the embers were raining down on people. And reportedly, an official told them to flee for their lives, and they did. But it ended up blocking the road, and that was kind of the first images that came out of the Palisades fire. Many of those cars were pushed aside by firefighting bulldozers that just kind of cleared them out of the way, wrecking some of them, damaging many others, and some of them ended up burning anyway. I saw footage last night of many of them that burned because the embers, they get into the wheel well and start the rubber on fire. That's a common way that they start. Yeah, so another fire in the Altadena area started in the evening, and in fact, they recorded 160 kilometer per hour gust in that area during that event. That is 100 mile per hour, which is not what you want when it is bone dry and you have a wildfire. It is the worst possible situation. It was hopeless. Firefighting aircraft even had to be grounded.
But it's one of those situations where we have a convergence of fire trucks, police officers. There are palm trees that are on fire, all covered in ash. There are flying embers, and we are in the thick of things, you could say.
The embers are what causes this problem. This is not a forest fire where the flames spread. It's the embers. The embers, in such bone dry conditions, they stay lit longer, and they can travel further. They were saying 1 to 2 miles, which is a long ways away from the fire, and you could see evidence of that quite easily.
Yeah. Well, you talk about having sometimes like a fire break. Well, why don't they have a fire break where some of the trees are cleared away? But, when it's this windy, those embers, like it just doesn't matter where you have a fire break. They just go for miles.
There was virtually nothing they could do. The reporter the next day didn't realize the extent of the damage to the Pacific Palisades. She asked an official when utility crews would be there restoring power and cable and internet lines, and this was the response of the official.
I don't want to sugarcoat this, and I don't want to make any false promises. The Palisades is a complete disaster zone. Everything is gone.
There's the occasional house still standing, but for the most part, it's like an atomic bomb went off.
The Pacific Palisades neighborhood in the west side region of Los Angeles, it's about 20 miles west of downtown LA. A quiet enclave where people didn't always lock their doors. There was a mixture of relatively affordable houses with the occasional gated mansions of people like Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, Martin Short, many other celebrities. It is arguably less pretentious than, say, Beverly Hills or Bel Air.
There were homes that wouldn't look out of place, Brian, in your neighborhood or even my neighborhood. They were very common homes, but then occasionally you had this gated mansion as you get into the ritzier areas. Many of them had a view of the Pacific Ocean. It was like an IMAX theater going up the hill. As you went up, you would be able to see over the neighbor's house closer to the ocean. So the Pacific Palisades is a place that struck me from an early age because of its name. The name Pacific Palisades comes from the term Palisades, a geological formation consisting of a series of cliff-like bluffs situated by a body of water, in this case, the Pacific Ocean. Now, I live in the prairies of Canada. You don't hear about neighborhoods of Los Angeles all the time, but sometimes you do.
Yeah.
And that one struck me. So it was in my mind, and I'd remember hearing it since I was a kid occasionally. It's on a hillside that lowers down to the ocean. It's known for its seclusion, being a close-knit community with a small-town feel. There's lots of little businesses and restaurants, and everybody could just walk to them. As you know, I was once in the comedy game many years ago. And there was a short time at the end of the 90s when I found myself on national television with my career ascending, if you will, and people were starting to suggest that I move to Los Angeles, including people who had actually moved to Los Angeles. So there was this thought of, might I have gone to Los Angeles? I never did, of course, but I have wondered. I looked into it. It would have taken a lawyer. I had won some awards, so I could have argued that I was a valuable person.
Yeah, they have a special designation for somebody of extraordinary talent or something like that as the way to get a green card sometimes.
Yeah, and I would have taken a lawyer, and I didn't have the money, not even close. But I've wondered ever since what that would have been like for me, of course. My son growing up was a geography nerd, and to this day, as an adult, he asked me, Dad, where would you live if you didn't live here? So I had to come up with an answer, and I started telling him the Pacific Palisades. And the reason I said that is because of a book I read that I'll get to in a moment. And when I traveled to California by car in 2018 with the family in tow, I chose one destination to check out for myself, and that was Pacific Palisades. I decided that's the first place we went. We had a hotel in Anaheim, not because we were going to Disneyland, but because that was a cheap hotel, and we traveled and drove and looked. We went there, and in fact, I went to Martin Short's address. I decided he's a good guy. He's a Canadian. And because of his book, his excellent memoir that he released about 10 years ago or so, it's called, I Must Say, My Life as a Humble Comedy Legend. And I listened to the audiobook because there's performances on the audiobook and musical numbers and things like that. And I listened to it again this week. Yeah, he frequently talked about the Pacific Palisades very fondly. So I decided to go to his house. I knew he wasn't there because he summers in Ontario. He's got a lovely big cottage in Muskoka or somewhere in Ontario, and he always goes there. And he has celebrity parties and people coming there. This is a clip from his audiobook. I find it heartbreaking to listen to because, like almost all homes there, Martin Short's is gone, according to The Wrap.
But by 1987, with a growing family, Nan and I had to make a decision on living in one place or the other, and we realized we were ready to put down roots in Southern California. Little Catherine and Oliver would have dual citizenship. I'm way too Canadian for them not to. But they, along with young Henry Short, who came along in 1989, would grow up in a pretty house that Nan and I found at the end of a quiet street in Pacific Palisades. It was the perfect house for us. Not ridiculously large or grand. The boys always shared the same bedroom, but airy and cozy, with a big living room anchored by a fireplace and an elegant curved staircase straight out of one of my favorite childhood sitcoms from the 1950s, Father Knows Best. The location was beautiful too, walking distance from the bluffs that overlooked the Pacific. The master bedroom opened onto a balcony where the water sparkled blue in the distance. We can't afford this, I thought every time I looked out at the ocean from my new bedroom. How could I possibly deserve this view? We bought the house on the basis of the income I was about to make from 2 pending movies. You can guess what happened next. Practically the second that Nancy and I signed the mortgage, one of the 2 movies, a David Lynch film with Steve Martin entitled One Saliva Bubble, fell through. I was in a panic. I anxiously said to Nan, "What if we can't afford this place? What if we have to sell it?" "Well, I guess we'd move somewhere," she calmly replied. "But that's not going to happen, Goofy. You know that." 27 years later, I'm still here. There are those who make a hobby of real estate, forever buying and flipping houses, getting bored with the residents after a year or 2. I'm totally different. Keep in mind, I spent the first 20 years of my life in the same house. I like to make a house a home and stay put. Nancy, too. So we did. I think this became part of the appeal of the family short as we settled into the Palisades. We were show folk with all the deviancy and egocentrism that such a description assumes, but we lived like a normal American nuclear family, or perhaps like a family on a long-running sitcom, going through the journey of life together on the same comfortingly familiar stage. The most concrete manifestation of our traditional short family values was our annual Christmas party.
So his annual Christmas party was legendary. But anyway, Martin Short Street was the place I wanted to go, breathe the air and take it in. And I only spent a couple minutes there. I wasn't want to be creepy, but walked around a bit, drove around the neighborhood, and it was wonderful. It was everything and more than was promised, really.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the perfect clip to play because I think that there'll be a lot of people listening to the news and thinking, oh, boo-hoo, these rich millionaires in California had their houses burned down. But of course, they're actual human beings who live in a place, and sure, he can afford to rebuild somewhere. But, you know, it's like losing your house could be...
Well, he's lost his memories. His wife passed away about 15 years ago. And, you know, the kids all grew up there. They have different houses. He's buying different houses for them. And he has, of course, his summer home. But, yeah, I mean, he'd be the one person who's a celebrity who would really care about losing their home there. And it was a modest home. It wasn't, you know, that spectacular.
So, yeah, according to his book, they had legendary Christmas parties every year, star-studded parties. Everybody sang and performed, including Spielberg. According to Short, no cameras allowed. 60 people crammed into his living room and dining room. It wasn't crazy big, which he sort of explained in the clip there. It sounds like not a crazy big house, short of being a mansion.
So why did this happen? Los Angeles is a desert, of course, but it does have a rainy season that always happens from October to basically spring. And this year, it did not happen.
To note is that this area had not received any measurable rainfall since April of last year. So basically for the last 9 months, this area has been dry. No rain of any kind. So the vegetation out there at the time the fire ignited was very, very dry, very critically dry for this time of year. That was the first thing. Then the day of the event, the area was under extremely strong Santa Ana wind event. In fact, probably one of the strongest Santa Ana wind events we've seen in the last several years. So because of that, we had wind gusts, very, very strong wind gusts, and along with those winds, a very dry atmosphere.
So Santa Ana winds are strong winds that blow from the mountains out to the ocean. Happens this time of year. What was different was it hasn't rained since April. Nary a bloody drop of precipitation since April. And last February, they had lots of rain, so everything, all the vegetation sprouted up and was thriving, and then you had months and months and months of drought and dry air when this event happened. With climate change, everything gets worse. You know, the winds get stronger, the air gets drier, gets hotter, everything, the droughts last longer. They skip a year sometimes. The rainy season skips a year, as it did this year. So they really did not have a chance in these fires. So far, 24 people, as of recording this, are confirmed dead. Thousands and thousands of homes are gone. Some people, Brian, you might be surprised, didn't have insurance because of climate change. They are not insuring people out there. And you and I have a friend, Nicole, who works in the film industry in Toronto. She has a friend that she worked with on a program called 13 Area who lost their home, completely gone. So there's, you know, as far away as we are, we have a connection to a connection. We're not that far away. And of course, everyone in LA probably knows someone who's lost a home. State Farm, that's the major insurer in the United States, stopped insuring California new homes due to fire risk from climate change. they won't do it. 150,000 people were under mandatory evacuation orders on the weekend, and some had to walk away from uninsured homes. I can't imagine.
Yeah, so from The Guardian, thousands of homeowners denied normal coverage may have to depend instead on an emergency state insurance program that is costly and complicated to join and caps its payouts at $3 million per household, significantly less than the value of many affluent homes razed along with their contents to the ground this week. And I don't know if you know about this, and there's a weird property tax law in California where as long as you own your house, you pay the same property taxes.
Okay.
Yeah.
As when you bought it?
When you bought it. Yeah,
really?
Your property tax doesn't go up.
Wow.
And it's one of the things that can make it affordable to live in California because, of course, it is a place with very expensive. But if you bought a house in the 70s or the 80s and you still live there, your property tax is the same. And I have relatives that live in California, and I learned it from them. So I have an uncle who bought a very expensive large house in Los Angeles. As near as I can tell, he's been paying the same property tax since the early 70s. So it's in many ways, it's a tax loophole for the rich because,
Well, the rich are always moving.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing. But so, yeah, as long as you own the house, you pay the same property tax. You are allowed to renovate, but you're not allowed to flatten it and start over again. So what people do in California, especially in these expensive neighborhoods, is they will flatten their house except for one wall. They'll leave one wall standing.
That does it?
And that does it. And you could build a completely new house around that, and it's considered a remodel rather than a tear down, and you keep your property tax the same law. So there is an issue with all of the houses lost in the fire as well, that they may lose this property tax protection. Now, I believe the governor said something about extending special circumstances. So, maybe they will be protected. But that's another possibility that since everyone has to rebuild, that their property tax could go up.
This is from Politico. State Farm dropped nearly 70% of its policies in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood last year. And that's according to state filing more than any other zip code in the state. Now, most people in the Palisades most people in LA didn't think the Palisades were, a fire risk area. There was lots of fire risk areas, but the Pacific Palisades wasn't on that list.
Well,
but the insurance companies know. They know because it's their bottom line. So they may have known better than other people. They may not have been overreacting.
There was special changes to insurance regulations in recent years because you're not normally allowed to raise people's insurance on a hunch that, things are going to turn bad. But because of climate change, they've had to change some of the rules. And so, better to jack up the rates than to cut people off entirely. But, because you're psychic, you knew about this before it happened because it's evidenced on our podcast last week. But had you gone so far as to think, maybe Pacific Palisades would burn down?
No. And I've been there and I just did not see it. But since then, I've watched videos, dash cam videos. People drive through neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like doing that in unusual places just to kill time, just to relax. Yeah. Well, it's very lush. There's a lot of vegetation there. It's practically like a jungle. People have grown a lot of things. Not all of those things burned, but, bushes next to houses, which we'll get into later, can be a problem, especially when it's very dry. I know you water these things, but it's hard to keep them dry. Anyway, this insurance fiasco forced more people into the FAIR program, FAIR, which was originally created in the 60s to ensure riot-scarred Los Angeles neighborhoods, but has since found more demand in rural and suburban fire-prone areas, these areas that intermix with urban and wildlife areas. Later in the show, we're going to talk about why fire is the biggest threat of climate change, fire in urban areas, and what you can do to protect your home, if anything.
And just a reminder, we love to hear from our listeners. If you've written in this week, we're holding the letters until next week due to our special coverage this week of what's going on in California. But please contact us, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com.
The raging wildfire now moves in, devastating the heart of Canada's oil-producing region. Terrified families rushing away on the one road out of town.
Firefighters call it the beast, 240,000-acre inferno shifting with the wind. Flames moving so quickly, homes are devoured in minutes.
Climate change has changed the nature of fire to the point that I coined a term, which is 21st century fire, because it really does burn in qualitatively different ways now. And one example is Fort McMurray, where we're in the subarctic, in the boreal forest, 600 miles north of the U.S. border. It's a cool, damp place historically. On May 3rd, the temperature was in the low 90s. It was like California, and the relative humidity was around 11 or 12%. And you have to go to Death Valley in July to find a comparable humidity.
That's author John Vaillant, author of Fire Weather. He's from Vancouver, and he did a 7-year stint writing a book about fire based on the Fort McMurray, Alberta fire. Many of you may have heard of it when it happened. You might have forgotten about it. It is a city that has emerged where the oil sands are in Canada. It's 100 kilometers away from Edmonton. It's a long way from anywhere. It's in the middle of the boreal forest. It's about 70,000 people, but there are at times 30,000 temporary workers there. So some of them are in camps. My brother-in-law was a person who went into a camp up until about a year ago when I think he retired. It's in the middle of basically nowhere, and it's the Athabasca oil sands. It is a very ritzy place, lots of money being made from oil. They mine millions of barrels a day, 4 million barrels a day of bitumen, which is basically tar. Because it exists to serve the oil industry, the median income in Fort McMurray is $200,000 per person, which is very high for anywhere.
Yeah, you can make a lot of money there. We talked about the graphic novel Ducks, which is about
yes,
the
and
author,
the author
Kate
referenced that book in a speech that I watched too. So
Kate Beaton worked there for 2 years to pay off her student loans from going to university, and managed to do it and get a great graphic novel out of it, although the rest of the experience was not.
I was going to go to Japan and teach English for 2 years to pay off my student loan. Probably would have been easier to work in that. I didn't do that because, Japan's economy fell apart in 1992, 93. So everyone supports that. There's companies that support the oil industry, vacuum companies that, vacuum water out of the ground and everything that supports them, mechanics. Most of the homes there cost between $300,000 to $500,000. This is basically a big suburb that was just built overnight, very quickly. And none of the homes are, terribly modest. On May 1st, 2016, a fire broke out in unusually dry forests with unusually hot weather with unusually low humidity. Winds brought the fire raging towards the city. People fled with the clothes on their backs out of the one highway that led out of the city. That's another problem with these areas that infringe on, wild areas, is that there's often one road going to it. Deer on fire ran into a car fleeing the fires. Paint melted on cars as they tried to leave. Of course, there was congestion in the roads, heavy smoke and heat. The fire was so relentless in the city that firefighters, and I didn't know this, demolished about 50 $500,000 homes to create a fire break in the city. It was incredible. Prior to that, some of these people worked on the Slave Lake fire. These are fires that are changing that firefighters hadn't seen before, and they didn't think they could save the city. They took extreme measures to try and save other homes by tearing down a $50 $500,000 home. It's a miracle everyone actually got out unscathed. They did. There's some related deaths afterwards, but the lingering effects of lung issues and PTSD remain for some residents, says the author of this book. And by the way, it's on audiobook. I know you don't read anymore, so I've got a hold on the audiobook. It's like a 10-week wait. But yeah, I've watched hours and hours of this guy giving lectures and interviews with him to get information because I couldn't get the book. The book is available on Amazon. You can get it there. But because of my vision, I decided I would wait for the audiobook because I have vision issues right now. So author John Vaillant spent 7 years following the fire, writing a book trying to understand what happened and what lessons can be learned.
Yeah, so I do love audiobooks, and Yes, I guess you're waiting for it from the public library, which is a great place to get audiobooks, and highly recommended that everybody sign up to their local library. So yeah, the award-winning book, it's called Fire Weather. Firefighters the world over told the author that the wildfires are not what they used to be. He sees fire now as the biggest threat from climate change, and they will impact cities more and more, like they did in Los Angeles, Fort McMurray, Lahaina, Hawaii, where 102 people lost their lives in 2023, which we would have talked about here. And we have a clip of the author here reading a passage from this book, Fire Weather.
When those houses are clad in vinyl siding, it literally adds fuel to the fire. Firefighters refer to this cheap, weatherproof material as solidified gasoline. When a boreal fire is projecting 1,000-degree heat and blizzards of burning embers into a recently built neighborhood, the houses stop being houses. They become, instead, petroleum vapor chambers.
He says that heat radiating from a fire like that, and by the way, when heat radiates from a fire, it travels at the speed of light. So it can be 200 feet away. It could be 500 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. And that heat will radiate ahead of where the fire is. So it preheats the places where it's going to burn. This is not the case in LA. In LA, there was not tall forests. There was just brush. And that brush burned homes. The embers burned homes. The embers, homes created more embers, and it was a repeat effect there. So fire superheats building materials in advance. And he says, ironically, most of the homes in Fort McMurray, which is there because of the fossil fuel industry, were made from fossil fuels. The glues in the wood, the particle board, the plywood, of course, the vinyl siding, plastic vinyl windows, all that stuff gets hot, and the tires on cars will get hot, and it'll off-gas. And this gas builds up ahead of the fire and just becomes a ball of fire itself because it is flammable. So yeah, and it dries out vegetation, and all the off gases come, and everything just bursts into a fiery cloud that the firefighters call dragons. Now here's John Vaillant talking to the Carnegie Institute about the commonalities of fire denial and climate change denial.
By now, the fire was in his neighborhood, coming down his street. His wife and daughter had already left in their vehicles on the one road out, which was extraordinarily dangerous, but there was no other choice. Meanwhile, he's there. I worked my whole life to pay for this house, to buy these things. I'm way up in Fort McMurray, 600 miles north of the U.S. border, in the middle of the forest. Not just because I love it here, but because this is where the money is, and this is where I was able to make a beautiful life for my family. And I'm not ready to give it up. And so there's a police officer dragging this guy away from his door. He fights the police officer off. He runs back. The police officer, what the hell do you think you're doing? He said, I'm locking my door. And then this fellow, Paul, looks at me as he's recounting the story, and he said, I didn't think my house would burn down. And again, 100-foot flames moving through the neighborhood in this like an inexorable wave. There was no other possibility for his house but to burn down. And yet he was defending his status quo, defending his worldview. And so this is where, when we talk about certain aspects of climate denial and people who are having a really hard time reconciling themselves to this new reality we find ourselves in, I don't think it's all cynicism. It's not all partisan. It's not all, people who just aren't getting it. It's really a lot of people who really want to hold on to the wonderful life they have.
Again, his book is called Fire Weather. The author is John Vaillant. It is spelled Vaillant. I want to end on this clip of him talking to Simon Fraser University last January because I think it's very important.
Oil, which still drives about 80% of the world's economic activity, is a 19th century fuel. The internal combustion engine was prototyped in 1860. Standard Oil, Exxon Esso, was founded in 1870. Bitumen, the stuff they mine and melt in Fort McMurray, is not a fuel at all. It is a driveway sealer. It takes billions of cubic feet of natural gas every day to melt and fractionate bitumen into substances Southern petroleum markets will want to buy. Again, we just crossed the 4 million barrel a day mark up in Fort Mac. So why on earth are we still doing this? Especially when scientists have understood the basics of the greenhouse effect literally since the 18th century. If you're in the petroleum industry, you're in the fire industry, which means you're in the CO2 industry, which means you're in the climate changing industry. What's alarming and possibly indictable is the fact that petroleum companies have known and discussed this for more than half a century. In fact, they've been leaders in climate science. And because Exxon in 1982 was the biggest corporation in the world, the wealthiest corporation in the world, it could hire the best scientists. And it did. And it put them on the climate file. And it said, figure out where this is all going. We understand that CO2 retains heat. We understand that it's a product of our industry. So what are the impacts going to be? This foreknowledge presented a quandary. How do you separate oil from fire or burning from emissions? You can't. And so starting in the 1980s, the industry, along with its allies in business and government, in churches, in finance, and in the media, embarked on a disinformation campaign to disavow and undermine their own science. It took me 7 years to figure it out. But this is a fact. Petroleum industry, the energy industry is a servant of fire.
And we'll be right back with more on what you can do and have to do. So what do you have to do when evacuating a fire? I was kind of curious because I came across this and I thought I would. A lot of these things surprise me. Okay, I'm going to go through them. You tell me what surprises you, Brian.
Sure.
You turn on all the lights.
Let me stop you right there. That surprises the hell out of me.
Indoors and outdoors. So if doesn't matter if it's day or night, as it was in Pacific Palisades, it gets very dark with the smoke. So you need the lighting. If they need to go into your house, they need to see, where.
Yeah.
They need to see around. Outdoor lights, that's obvious. You want the outdoor bushes and everything lit up as best as you can. So you turn everything on. You, of course, close all the doors, interior and exterior. Does that surprise you? You have to make chambers within your house so that the fire doesn't spread.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that, but no, that doesn't surprise me. That's good common sense.
And you turn off your gas line, which is outdoors that leads into your house. Most people have natural gas. Not everybody in North America, of course, but a lot of people do. So you turn that off. You energize your garden hoses with nozzles on the ends of them. So you will take your garden hose out if it is reeled up. You will energize, you will turn the water on to that hose. It will inflate and get hard. And then you have a nozzle at the end. You leave that there for the firefighters to come and put out spot fires because they may not have a hose and they may not be able, it'll take too long to get one.
So you turn the water on, but you have the nozzle off.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. You don't leave it running. You turn the nozzles on, front and back if possible. And you leave them for the firefighters to put out spot fires. You move patio furniture away from the house. Patio furniture is flammable, especially the cushions, because they're often made out of vinyl. And that's important. Also, wicker's bad, obviously. And, doormats that are fiber or anything natural. Put up ladders on the corner of your house. I never heard of that, never thought of that.
Yep. I wouldn't have thought of that, but it does make sense.
Most people have ladders that go to the roof, I guess, for maintenance and things. You put those on the corner of the house where it's accessible and visible by firefighters in case there's a spot fire on your roof. It takes them a long time to get a ladder, from the fire truck, so they would use your ladder. So that's what you do. Barrel of water, if you have one in your backyard for putting out spot fires, scoops, if you do have a barrel of water, you could make that accessible. You move propane tanks away from flammable objects. I think that makes sense, obviously. You turn off your HVAC, your air conditioning or heating or furnace, right? So it doesn't blow smoke through your house. Leave your doors unlocked. So you want the firefighters to be able to go into your house. And sometimes they just want to check and see if someone's there. It's for the firefighters. Prop open gates, because gates connect a fence, which is flammable, to the house. so it's joined to the house.
Yeah.
And it creates a separation if you leave your gate on course and lets the firefighters get into your yard, which they very much needed to do. And if you have time, you can duct tape or use other tape over vents to keep the embers from flowing in. Now, fireproofing your home. These fires in Fort McMurray and the Pacific Palisades and the Eden Fire in Los Angeles seemed like, pointless that you could possibly do anything. But there are ways that you can not guarantee, but help prevent your house from burning. And there's examples out in the middle of wildfires. Everyone's house burns down, but the people who do the following.
And also potentially helpful if we build a new cottage at our lake, which is in a boreal forest.
And that is something that has crossed my mind, Brian, is your new cottage, because being out there, we were there, vacationing in high fire risk, like the first 2 summers during COVID. I remember the high fire risk or extreme was there when you come into the provincial park. And then I thought about that. Basically, though, I worry about it too, because I live, there's been grass fires around here. And if there is a grass fire here, it could light my fence on fire, which would go all the way to my house and light my house on fire and my neighbor's house and their garage, and embers would be, if structures started burning from, the same situation, very hot, very dry, and the embers are blowing here, would I be prepared? I would not. And I would have to do, certain things, like I would soak my old fence because it absorbs water, I noticed. So, and then I struggle cutting the vegetation because I border a pipeline grass field, and the weeds grow literally higher than me. And it's hard because your whippersnapper, your little electric weed whacker doesn't, you need a chainsaw practically to get through some of those weeds. So I always have because I never go out there hardly anymore. The kids are older now. And I used to go out there all the time, and then I get surprised. So, 5 feet around your home needs to be cleared of combustible vegetation. I can't stress this enough. I watched last night raw video of some dude. I don't know if he's a journalist or a wannabe journalist, but he went into the Pacific Palisades as it was burning. Mm-hmm. And he walked around, and it was eerie. And I posted this. I didn't post this, but I will post this. I posted it on my Facebook page for my friends. It's eerie because you're just watching houses burn or about to burn.
Yeah.
There's nobody around. And then when there is firefighters around, they weren't talking. No one was yelling. They were just very quiet. And all you could hear was like giant campfires, essentially, the wood popping. And you would see, little embers. It's not one ember that lights a fire. It's a collection of them. So the wind blows, and you know how garbage and things collects in areas. Well, the embers collect, and if you have vegetation next to your house, even if it's dry, even if you keep it wet, though, it's going to dry out because the fire weather is just basically a giant hairdryer that's blowing down and drying everything out in advance. So, you got to keep vegetation away from your home. Certainly, wood bark mulch is bad. Don't do that. If you live in a fire-prone area, you're worried about it. Stones are much better, or crushed rock and things like that. 5 feet away from your home if possible. Now, here's a big one. It is, you know how there's attic vents? Most people don't think about them, but on your house, there's roof vents and attic vents. An attic is basically like the outer layer of a tent. It's just meant to keep the rain out and ventilate. It's not, insulated in itself. It's insulated on the roof of the house. But that's what happens is the embers get in through that vent. And sometimes there's screens to keep rodents out, but they're too wide of a hole to keep the embers out. And what they say is a screen similar to what you would have on your window. Okay. So the same type of thing. It lets the air through, but not stuff, including embers. So you have to change that to 1/4 inch and make sure this happens at your cottage.
Yeah.
I would watch a couple fire prepare videos and just make sure your architect does that, because you do live in a forest, and who knows what could happen. Because your kids are going to have this cottage, right? I mean, theoretically, you're hoping that they'll continue to use it for another generation, and that's 30, 40 years into climate changing world, and who knows what's going to happen in that time. So I would very much be making your home, any home for the future, which is something you have to do now. Clear out debris from the eaves. They say a lot of the homes that went up in Fort McMurray, I remember at the time they said the embers fell onto the eaves. The eaves were dry, and they lit the debris on fire. And then, the shingles themselves don't go on fire, but there's wood under the shingles that is exposed to the fire coming up from the eaves.
Yeah. And these are the rain gutters. I think eaves troughs, I think that's a Canadian term, but rain gutters around your roof. Yeah.
And, you can build a home without rain gutters. That's an option, apparently, if you have a large enough overhang. So maybe that's something to consider when you build your cottage. Move patio cushions away from your home. Clear grasses or keep them very short. Grasses are very flammable in these situations. So you can have wildflowers and wild grasses. If you have, say, a property, that's an acreage or a larger area, a lot of these places that border the wild vegetation areas have that. Non-flammable vegetation only. Cedars are bad. That's an example of a bad thing. And I've got 3 very large cedars in my yard next to my fence, which would go up like giant candles very easily. And in fact, some years they're very dry. They're drought resistant, but they get very, very dry. 5 inches of the foundation, the first 5 inches of your foundation is important. So if you have vinyl siding go to the ground, you can replace the first 5 inches and put a cement board or something in. That's important because that's where the embers gather, is right next to your foundation, whatever's there. It doesn't have to be the whole thing that are vinyl. No firewood under the deck or near the house. Decks are a problem. What's under decks are a problem, so you have to do that. Wood shingles bad. Asphalt is apparently okay. Clear debris off the roof. If you have a roof that has different angles and different peaks, that's a problem because stuff gathers in the where the peaks join and in the valleys or whatever they call them. So one simple roof line is the most efficient for living in a firefighter zone without changes. And you make sure you get those pine needles off the roof. I know that there's lots of pine needles on your out cottage there, your second building. It was just covered in them.
Tons of pine needles.
That would go up. Not just you would care. But it would go up pretty good. Did you know, Brian, you can get private firefighters in Los Angeles? Some people do. Yeah, it costs $1,000 to get them in advance, but $5,000 during an emergency. And some people are actually installing a private fire hydrant in their home. And that's very expensive because it's a costly, connection to the water main. But you can do that, and you have to pay the city a bunch of money up front, I guess. But people do that. They're smaller fire hydrants. But, you watch these hoses, a garden hose in a wind event, they do nothing.
Yeah.
They do nothing. And even the firefighters, you have to watch these videos. The firefighters' hoses, and I've used one for a television show. They're incredibly powerful and have an incredible amount. They were like nothing. The wind was barely keeping them, from hitting where they wanted to go. And they were just disappearing into a mist. So some people will install permanent sprinklers on the roof and their soffits. So that's another option, is a permanent sprinkler. They look kind of funny, but you can do that. And I would if I lived in a forest, I think.
Yeah, and I guess there is a danger of the fire hydrants have run dry in some cases in Los Angeles. So there's a danger, I suppose, that your private fire hydrant or your sprinkler on the roof doesn't keep going. But say again, on our cottage, if we have battery backup, because it'll have an independent water system, there's no water grid out there. So if we have battery backup, we could theoretically maybe put sprinklers on the roof that can be turned on remotely and run as long as the batteries are working.
I think that's a great idea. I love technology for solving problems, and that would be one of them. But that is our show for this week. The lightning round will return next week with your letters. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, we'll see you next week.
Join the Clean Energy Show's Clean Club with a YouTube channel membership or on Patreon and support our weekly climate programming. Get early access to all our videos and podcasts, as well as members-only bonus content, Discord server access, and a monthly bonus podcast from Brian and James. The Clean Energy Show is released every week wherever you get audio, as well as YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram.